Hello, welcome back to Talking Europe with me, Catherine Nicholson. In this part of the programme, coronavirus, climate change and all the other priorities for the European Union. I'm going to be speaking to the co-president of the European Greens Group at the European Parliament, a man who recently said that time was running out for the European Commission to come up with bold proposals for the continent's recovery from the pandemic. Philippe Lamberts, thanks very much for being with us there from Brussels. Mr. Lamberts, I'd like to start first off by talking about the coronavirus pandemic and specifically the big EU issue regarding that this month, a summit where a recovery fund is going to be the big topic of discussion. We're looking at Europe facing its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Now, I know you've been advocating for an increase in the overall EU budget, well above what the European Commission and the member states have been talking about up to now. Huge sums of that to go into the recovery fund. Where would all this money come from?
Well, most of that money will be borrowed on the financial markets and reimbursed over a period of up to 30 years. So I think this makes perfect sense as a Keynesian response to the pandemic. Of course, the Parliament would have expected a significantly higher figure than what the Commission came up with. But let's admit that the Commission at least got the architecture right in terms of borrowing together. So the Commission would borrow for the European Union and the refunding of the loans would be done together as well. Mm-hmm. And that is what is absolutely crucial. So it's a question of having a common response versus individualized responses by member states who would only increase the tensions within the eurozone.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of talk about that sort of EU solidarity regarding the recovery, but one major issue has already raised its head. How much money will be dispersed through grants, money that's just given to the member states, and also things like whether big economies like Italy and Spain could actually become net beneficiaries of the next EU budget, considering the impact the pandemic has had on those countries. We have states like the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark and Sweden with more balanced books, we could say. And there's a great sense among people there that it's perhaps unfair to ask them to finance the recovery of other states.
Well, I would caution against using that kind of moralistic argument, because I could tell the Dutch Prime Minister that it's quite unfair to see his country stealing tax revenue away from other member states on a consistent basis. That is also unfair. So if one wants to transform this into a shouting match, there are arguments on both sides of the table. So I would urge the European leaders to refrain from that and to look at this as a matter of common interest. It is in the Netherlands, in Finland, in Austria's, in Germany's best interest that Europe comes out prosperous from this pandemic. I mean, letting the eurozone fail, because that is what is at stake, would hurt dramatically the interests of the countries I mentioned. And so again, this is not a matter of charity, it is a matter of common interest. Mm-hmm. And the Dutch, better than anyone else, should be able to understand that.
All right, just moving on to one specific sector of the European economies that's been in the news this week, airlines. Governments around Europe have been handing out state aid to their flag carrier airlines. For example, Air France getting aid worth 7.6 billion euros from Paris. However, groups including Greenpeace, a former EU climate commissioner, are saying that these rescues should have climate conditions attached. However, industry bodies say that they are already taking steps to reduce their climate impact via aviation. Is it fair to be adding these extra conditions right now at this moment of crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, the airline industry has been consistent in its stubborn opposition to anything that would curb its growth. And indeed, putting the right price on air travel, a price that reflects its ecological impact, is a must. And so I'm afraid that actually here it's not a matter of having them accept conditions. We politicians must have the courage to start taxing kerosene, to reflect the true price of air travel. Will air travel disappear? No, probably not. But does the airline industry need to shrink? Yes, absolutely. Is it fair to have a form of public support accompanying the reshaping of the airline industry? Yes, but there must be a reshaping. We cannot just go on business as usual and expect air travel to grow single digits every year eternally. This is simply not feasible for our planet, and therefore we have to accept that change is underway. So we are advocates as Greens of avoiding economic collapse, because rebuilding after collapse is more difficult than accompanying change. So we consider that support to the airline and aircraft industry may be warranted, but indeed that must accompany drastic change. And no, the world will never be as before for that industry. And we have to accept that. I mean, in the past, we have seen industries reshaped or even disappear. Again, I didn't say that the airline industry would disappear, but yes, it needs to be resized quite significantly. And there, if I may just add a word, because I saw the declarations of Michael O'Leary of Ryanair, I prefer public support going to airlines that have decent social working conditions than to people like Mike O'Leary, who have a long track record of abusing the people who work for them.
So perhaps other conditions as well as climate considerations as well. Just staying with climate change
Absolutely.
And the transition. A few days ago, you were one of 700 signatories of a call for European climate and employment pact as part of the recovery plan. One of the proposals is a 5% tax here in Europe on the biggest corporations, saying that would bring in 100 billion euros a year to fund a climate and biodiversity budget. Could you flesh out a bit for us what that would actually mean? What size of companies?
I will not go into the details, because this would be the objective of a political negotiation, and I'm one of the signatories of that call. We need to do something serious about raising tax income from those who basically benefited from the année folle of neoliberal globalization, and that requires a common European effort. And again, to me, it's not so much a matter of going after the digital companies. It's to go after those companies, multinationals, who basically manage to end up paying 5, 6, 2, 3% taxes on their profit on an annual basis, rather than what you would expect 20 or 25%.
Okay, just moving on to an issue that's absolutely dominated the news this week, more so than the pandemic, I think we can say. A lot of focus on the treatment and status of people of colour and ethnic minorities, particularly in the United States. But people here in Europe have been flagging up there are issues here as well. Policing in France, for example. Recently, the European Network for Racial Equality said that there was evidence of racial profiling in some of the police checks during the COVID-19 lockdowns. With all this focus on the United States, are Europe's issues being swept under the rug a little?
Well, indeed, I think what happened in the US is also a wake-up call for Europe. The situation is probably not as bad, because we do not have that long string of murders by policemen of black people, but racial profiling happens. And indeed, we have had cases during the confinement of people dying. Well, basically, these were less well-off people living in cramped apartments who had more difficulties than others living in confinement, and they end up facing the police, and sometimes with deadly consequences. So yes, I think that we also have to look at ourselves and take a hard look, and especially the pandemic has already raised inequality in Europe, and of course, people of different racial origins are on the losing end of those inequalities, and so they are being sharpened. And therefore, what we expect is that indeed any recovery plan at national or European level not only has to focus on the green transition, but on restoring more than a semblance of social justice. Basically, we have seen our societies becoming more unequal every year. Well, we have to reverse that trend in a context that actually accentuates the trend.
Another foreign policy issue for the EU, what's happening in China and Hong Kong. The foreign policy chief of the EU, Josep Borrell, has expressed grave concern over the Chinese security law for Hong Kong. Now, the US has been talking about sanctions on China over this. The UK is going to offer citizenship to 3 million people from Hong Kong, potentially, if the law goes ahead. Josep Borrell, though, has ruled out EU sanctions on Beijing. Considering the strong responses from EU allies that I mentioned, should the EU be talking about sanctions at this point?
Well, I think that the first thing EU should do is get its act together in terms of sizing its relationship with China. Obviously, China presents a major geopolitical challenge. We want multilateral governance, and in that sense, China is a major player that cannot be ignored. And so there can be no question of isolating China or singling it out. Yet, the problem is that China is playing a dividing game in Europe. It plays one member state against the other. And as long as member states do not realize that actually it's to their common detriment, China will have a field day in Europe. And so the first thing is that we should get our act together and get a common strategic vision with China, because we will only be heard by China if we speak with one voice. And indeed, speak softly, but carry a big stick. That's basically what China does. By the way, of late, it has been speaking less softly. I believe in diplomacy. I believe in peaceful international relations. But we have to recognize that China positions itself right now basically as a fierce opponent of liberal democracy. I mean, Xi Jinping is making no mystery about that he wants the authoritarian type system that China has to prevail in the world. And this is something we cannot let happen.
All right, Philippe Lamberts, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much, though, for speaking to us there. Philippe Lamberts, co-president of the European Greens at the European Parliament. Thanks to you for watching as well. See you next time on Talking Europe.